The wind whistled across the jagged peaks of the ironclad mountains, carrying with it the acrid scent of smoke and stone. Roland Cale, a human veteran long retired from the interstellar campaigns that had defined his youth, stood on the edge of a rocky precipice, eyes scanning the valley below. His boots, worn to the nub and dusted with ash, betrayed the years of relentless travel and the battles that had etched themselves into the lines of his face. Every scar told a story, every stiff joint whispered a cautionary tale, but there was a quiet satisfaction in surviving, in bearing witness to a universe that had chewed up countless others like him. Roland's home, or rather the cabin he had carved out in this remote, untamed frontier, was a haphazard blend of human ingenuity and makeshift adaptation. Solar panels, scavenged from long-abandoned colonies, hung unevenly on the roof. A shallow stream, glimmering under the pale light of twin moons, ran nearby, offering water and a rhythm that punctuated the solitude he had grown accustomed to. He had chosen this life deliberately. No command chains, no politics, no civilian bureaucracies, just the raw cadence of survival. Yet, beneath his gruff exterior, an unspoken longing lingered, subtle and persistent, a quiet yearning for connection beyond the ghosts of war. It was during one of these solitary forays into the upper reaches of the valley that he first heard the distressed cries. At first, he thought them echoes of the wind bouncing off the cliffs, or perhaps some small creature caught in the jagged rocks. But the wails persisted, rising in urgency and in pitch. They carried the unmistakable note of terror, fear too young, too raw to be masked by instinct. And then he saw it, a small dragon no larger than a human child, trapped in a narrow cleft, scales glinting silver like fractured glass, eyes wide with terror and something deeper, a piercing, primordial intelligence. Roland's first instinct was caution. Dragons were magnificent, yes, but dangerous. He had heard stories from the old campaigners about drakes that could incinerate a man with a single exhalation. Yet, there was something in the creature's eyes that stirred a long-dormant protective impulse. Perhaps it was the unmistakable trust of a lost soul, the way it had curled into itself in a mixture of fear and hope. Without thinking, he extended a gloved hand. "Easy," he murmured, voice rough but steady. "I'm not gonna hurt you." It took several tense minutes to coax the creature out, its wings trembling as though they carried the weight of every storm that had ever blown across this land. When it finally leapt into his arms, warm and surprisingly heavy, Roland felt a strange, almost electric resonance, the sort of connection that defied explanation. He wasn't sure whether it was instinct, luck, or some deeper cosmic alignment, but he knew somehow that his life had just changed. Back at his cabin, the dragon, whom he would later name Sylvie, revealed layers of complexity that belied her size. Her scales shimmered in shifting shades of moonlight, a natural camouflage that seemed almost ceremonial. She nuzzled Roland's chest with a surprising gentleness, eyes closing briefly as if she understood the weight of his own history, the countless battles, the losses, the nights spent staring at stars that had long since gone cold. He found himself talking to her, at first in monosyllables, later in stories of planets and starships and the strange humans who had once called themselves heroes. Sylvie listened, tilting her head in ways that suggested comprehension, even judgment, and a bond began to form. The days that followed were a quiet dance of discovery. Roland learned her favorite resting spots, the delicate way she fed on wild fruits and small prey, the subtle patterns in her behavior that hinted at intelligence far beyond what any human might expect. And yet, with every tender moment, there lingered a shadow, a question gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Where was her family? Why had she been abandoned in these unforgiving mountains? The answer seemed to hide in the wind, just out of reach, teasing him with whispers of something far larger, something that might challenge the fragile equilibrium he had built for himself. The valley itself seemed alive in response to their presence. Trees swayed as though bowing to some unseen rhythm, and even the water's flow carried an almost musical cadence when Sylvie played near the stream. It was a world of subtle enchantments, hints of a magic older than the campaigns Roland had fought in, older than the scattered human colonies. At night, he would sit outside, Sylvie curled at his feet, staring at constellations that mapped the fates of dragons and humans alike. The silence was thick but not oppressive. It was a silence full of expectation, a calm before some inevitable revelation. Then, on a twilight when the skies bled violet and gold, Roland noticed it, a series of deep scratches in the earth, too deliberate to be natural, leading toward a thicket beyond the cabin. His instincts, honed by years of combat, prickled. He approached cautiously, Sylvie at his side, her small claws clicking on the stones. Hidden among the brambles, a cluster of feathers, no scales, caught the dying light. They were remnants of a struggle, a trail left by someone or something far more powerful than either of them. The sense of being watched, of being drawn into a story much larger than his own, settled over him like a cloak. Roland knew in that precise moment that this chance rescue was only the beginning. Sylvie was not merely a lost dragon. She was a fragment of a world he had yet to comprehend, a piece of a puzzle that could append everything he thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and love. Somewhere out there, her mother waited, or perhaps mourned. And when that meeting came, it would force Roland to confront not just the tangible threats of the wild, but the invisible ones within himself: guilt, fear, and the fragile hope that he could protect this small creature, and maybe, just maybe, find something of his own lost humanity along the way. This sets the stage: a human veteran, a lost young dragon, and the quiet but potent tension of discovery and the unknown. The tone mixes introspection, description, and subtle foreshadowing. If you like, I can immediately move on to Section 2, where the rising action begins. Roland and Sylvie face external challenges and hints of the mother dragon appear. The morning sun bled through the jagged peaks and slivers of molten gold, illuminating the valley with a fragile warmth that belied the harshness of the mountains. Roland moved with methodical precision, gathering firewood while Sylvie flitted along the edge of the stream, her small claws splashing in the shallow water. There was an ease in the rhythm of these mornings, a fragile routine that felt like a bridge between his solitude and the chaotic past he had left behind. Yet, the valley whispered secrets, and Roland knew he was not alone, not in spirit and perhaps not in presence. Sylvie's ears twitched as a faint sound pierced the soft rustle of the trees. A low, almost imperceptible rumble, like distant thunder, vibrated through the rocks beneath his feet. Roland froze, instincts sharpening. "Sylvie," he murmured, crouching, voice low. The dragonlet hissed softly, curling closer. The sound grew, measured, deliberate, alive. It was not natural. Not wind, not river, not falling rock. Something approached. Hours passed in tense anticipation. Birds scattered, a sudden flurry of movement that mirrored the unease winding through the valley. And then they saw it, a huntress, or rather, the remnants of one. Tracks scorched into the earth, broken branches, and the faint smell of smoke marked the path of another predator. Or perhaps, another dragon. Roland's heart beat faster. The notion of another dragon in these parts had seemed unlikely. Sylvie's eyes widened, reflecting the same fear he felt, but also curiosity, the instinctive knowledge of kin, of connection, even if shrouded in danger. Roland decided to investigate. Slinging a makeshift spear across his back, he followed the trail cautiously, Sylvie gliding silently at his shoulder, wings beating softly against the air. They moved through a labyrinth of cragged cliffs, narrow ledges, and shadowed groves, each step an exercise in patience and vigilance. The valley here was less forgiving. Jagged rocks tore at his boots, thorn-laden bushes tugged at his coat, and an uneasy quiet pressed down from above as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. It was near a moss-covered ravine that they found the first tangible clue, a fragment of scale larger than Sylvie's entire forearm, iridescent and dark as obsidian, almost black against the green moss. Roland knelt, running a cautious finger along the smooth surface. The shape and shimmer were unmistakable. This was no ordinary dragon. And the placement, it was deliberate. A warning? A marker? The answer, if it existed, remained tantalizingly out of reach. Sylvie pressed against him, nuzzling his side as though sensing both the danger and the importance. Roland and Sylvie camped at the edge of the ravine that night, a small fire crackling while shadows danced across the rocks. He spoke softly, recounting stories from campaigns he had survived, lessons in strategy and endurance, anecdotes of comrades lost and won. Sylvie listened intently, her small eyes gleaming with intelligence, head tilting as if she understood not just the words but the emotional cadence behind them. And yet, between the moments of quiet storytelling, Roland felt a persistent pull, a tug of destiny that he could not name. The feeling was like a chord struck somewhere deep in the marrow of the universe, resonant, insistent, and unavoidable. The following days became a delicate dance of observation and survival. Roland taught Sylvie to navigate treacherous cliffs, to judge the wind currents for short flights, and to hunt with precision, though always under his watchful eye. He marveled at her agility, at the way she could vanish between shafts of sunlight, her scales reflecting the hues of the rocks and water. But it was more than mere survival. There was a growing consciousness in Sylvie, an emotional depth that startled him. She would sometimes mimic his gestures, tilt her head in thoughtful pause, or watch the clouds drifting across the twin moons with a faraway sadness. It was as if she carried memories not her own, or a grief too large for her size. One evening the atmosphere shifted. A shiver ran through the valley, a vibration felt more than heard. The trees seemed to bend with anticipation, the river's flow quickened. And then Roland saw it, a shadow, enormous and serpentine, gliding across the cliff face in a movement too fluid for a human eye to follow at first glance. Sylvie froze, wings extended in defensive posture, her small body tensing as though bracing for a lifetime of consequence. Roland's pulse quickened, not from fear alone but from a strange recognition. There was an unmistakable grace in the shadow's motion, a weight of sorrow and power that filled the valley in ways words could never capture. The encounter lasted only moments, the shadow disappearing as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the memory of movement and a sudden, inexplicable sense of anticipation. Roland stared at Sylvie, who seemed to quiver in a mix of excitement and fear. He realized then that the dragonlet's mother was alive, and that this was no ordinary reunion waiting to happen. There were stakes far greater than survival in these mountains. He had adopted Sylvie, yes, but now the responsibility of understanding, of confronting the unknown, weighed heavily on him. The nights that followed were restless. Roland lay awake on the rocky floor of the cabin, listening to the wind as it whispered through the peaks. He reflected on the strange resonance between him and Sylvie, on the fragment of obsidian scale, and on the shadow that had passed like a living memory. Each thought led to another, spiraling in complexity. Was the mother dragon mourning, seeking, or testing? Could a human intervene without risking catastrophe? And beneath all of this, an almost ineffable question tugged at him, one that he could not yet name. What did it mean for him, a battle-worn human, to be entwined in a destiny that transcended his own species, his own understanding? Roland realized that survival in these mountains required more than skill with spear or fire. It required empathy, patience, and a willingness to confront emotions long buried under the rubble of war. He knew that Sylvie, small though she was a catalyst for something larger, something that might unravel the solitary life he had painstakingly built. And somewhere deep in the cliffs, perhaps just beyond the reach of human sight, her mother waited. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, a promise that the story had only just begun. The morning was deceptively calm, the valley bathed in the soft glow of dawn, yet Roland could feel a tension threading through the air like a live wire. Sylvie perched atop a boulder, wings tucked but quivering slightly, as if aware of a presence he could not yet see. Roland had become attuned to her subtle signals, the way her nostrils flared, the almost imperceptible shift in her tail, the quickening of her breathing. There was something approaching, something far larger than the small dragon he had rescued. He had been following the fragmented clues for days, scale shards embedded in bark, scorch marks along stone surfaces, an unmistakable warmth in the air that wasn't fire but raw life. Roland's mind, trained through decades of conflict, pieced together the pattern. Sylvie's mother wasn't just nearby, she had been searching for her child, perhaps aware of Roland's protective role, perhaps testing him. A part of Roland's rational mind wanted to retreat, to give them space, but another, less disciplined part, one fueled by loyalty, curiosity, and the unspoken bond he had forged with Sylvie, urged him forward. The first sight of her was surreal. A shadow stretched across the eastern cliffs, elongating as if the mountains themselves had come alive. Then, with a grace that was almost liquid, she descended. Scales glimmered like molten gold interspersed with deep crimson, eyes the color of twilight, and wings that spanned nearly the width of the ravine. Every movement radiated sorrow and strength intertwined, a raw poetry of grief and power. Roland instinctively ducked behind a rock, unsure whether to be awed or terrified. Sylvie, however, leapt from her perch, rushing toward the larger dragon with a confidence only the very young could possess. "Sylvie, wait!" Roland shouted, heart hammering, but the dragonlet was already in motion, nuzzling her mother's chest. The larger dragon recoiled for a fraction of a second. Then, impossibly, the grief and relief in her eyes became palpable. Roland watched as tears, visible like molten crystal, streaked down her cheek. He realized something profound. Dragons, despite their power, carried emotional truths as vividly as humans, perhaps even more so. Sylvie's mother turned her gaze toward Roland, and in that instant the air shifted. He felt the weight of her assessment, as if the dragon could see his very soul, measuring courage, intent, and worthiness. Fear prickled along his spine, yet he stood his ground. "I'm not your enemy," he said aloud, though he wasn't sure she understood his words in human speech. But her stare softened ever so slightly, a recognition that he had acted with compassion rather than possession. It was then that the valley erupted. A second shadow, darker, more violent, surged over the cliffs. A rogue predator, a wyvern-like creature drawn perhaps by the scent of young dragon or the disturbance in the valley. Sylvie's mother roared, a sound that shook loose rocks and rattled Roland's teeth. The smaller dragons scattered in instinctive fear, and Roland had to act. Years of combat honed his reflexes. He grabbed a fallen branch, ignited a small flare from his survival kit, and waved it toward the intruder. It was a feeble defense, almost laughable against a predator of that magnitude, yet the fire, the human defiance, caught the creature's attention just long enough for the mother dragon to dive with ferocious precision. The battle was brief but violent. Flames met claws, wings battered against rock, and the air trembled with the echoes of roars and screeches. Roland clung to a ledge, heart pounding, mind racing to find ways to survive. Sylvie, small but brave, darted between the shadows of the combatants, letting out high-pitched calls that seemed to guide her mother's strikes. Then, as suddenly as it began, the predator fled, wounded but alive, disappearing into the mountains with a screech that promised return. The mother dragon, breathing heavily, turned her gaze back to Roland. This time the assessment lingered longer. He met it with calm, unwavering eyes. The moment after the battle was charged with a strange intimacy. Sylvie nestled between Roland's legs, small body trembling, while her mother knelt beside them, nose brushing gently against the human shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement, almost gratitude. Roland realized then that the dragon's world was not only one of physical prowess, but also one of intricate bonds and subtle social codes. He had passed a test he didn't fully understand, and yet the implications were enormous. This was a being of immense power, and it had granted him a place, however tentative, in its fold. That night, Roland sat outside his cabin, Sylvie asleep in his lap, and he reflected on the encounter. The mountains seemed quieter, though the memory of the predator's screech still echoed in his ears. Sylvie's mother had disappeared as silently as she had appeared, leaving only a promise in the wind. She would return, and when she did, Roland's role would shift from observer to participant in something far beyond mere survival. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him, not just for Sylvie, but for understanding the larger forces at play in a world that had long existed beyond human comprehension. He wondered, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, what it would mean when mother and child were fully reunited. Would she accept him as part of their bond, or see him as an interloper? The questions gnawed at him, yet there was a stirring of hope, a fragile, luminous thread that reminded him of why he had adopted Sylvie in the first place. She was not merely a creature of scales and fire, but a living embodiment of trust and the possibility of redemption. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the cliffs, Sylvie's mother watched, silent and vigilant. Roland knew the valley had shifted irreversibly, that the mundane rhythms of his life had been replaced by a narrative far larger, more intricate, and more perilous. The midpoint had arrived. His past, his present, and his unlikely bond with Sylvie had collided with forces that demanded courage, empathy, and a willingness to embrace a destiny he had never sought. Roland's hand brushed Sylvie's soft scales and he whispered almost to himself, "We'll face it together. Whatever comes." The wind carried his words across the valley, brushing against the shadows where her mother lingered, a silent, watchful guardian of the bond he had forged. The twist was clear. The story was no longer about a single human and a lost dragon, but about a family, fractured and rediscovered, and a world that had begun to notice their presence in ways both beautiful and terrifying. The storm arrived without warning, a sudden tempest that ripped through the ironclad mountains with ferocious intensity. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning jagged cliffs into slick, treacherous slopes, and lightning tore the sky apart in violent bursts. Roland gritted his teeth, clutching Sylvie close as they scrambled along the narrow ledge above the ravine. The wind roared in his ears, carrying with it a chorus of distant cries, dragons perhaps, or some other force stirred by the chaos. This was no ordinary storm. It was a culmination of everything he had sensed building for weeks. The restless energy of the valley, the predators drawn by the young dragon, and the simmering presence of Sylvie's mother, always just beyond perception. Sylvie's wings beat frantically, her small claws digging into Roland's coat. "Hold on," he shouted, voice barely audible above the roar, but her mother's silhouette appeared on the cliff above, immense and radiant even through the sheets of rain. She had come, not as a shadow this time but in full, terrifying, awe-inspiring presence. Lightning illuminated the scales along her neck, revealing patterns of grief and resilience, and her eyes, dark yet luminescent, fixed on Roland with a scrutiny that made his chest tighten. The predator they had encountered before returned, emboldened by the chaos, swooping through the storm with a feral shriek. Its wings struck violently against the gale, and its talons glinted with lethal precision. Roland barely had time to react. Instinct took over. He shoved Sylvie behind a jutting rock and hurled a flare into the predator's path. Fire met fury as the creature faltered, snarling, but the mother dragon dove with terrifying elegance, claws extended, teeth bared. The two collided midair in a violent ballet of power, rain and sparks of lightning highlighting the clash. Roland could only watch, heart pounding, as the battle unfolded like a living storm. Sylvie chirped from her hiding place, wings trembling in fear and anticipation. Roland's hands shook, not from the cold, but from the realization that this fight was not merely about survival. It was a test of worth, courage, and trust. He had already survived wars among humans, navigated the political and physical chaos of countless campaigns, yet here he felt utterly insignificant in the face of primal force. The storm seemed to respond to the combatants. Trees bent with reverence or fear, rivers swelled, and rocks tumbled as if the very earth acknowledged the significance of what unfolded. In a moment of terrifying brilliance, Sylvie's mother struck the predator, sending it crashing into the side of a cliff. The creature let out a final screech, wounded and humiliated, and disappeared into the darkening mountains. Rain obscured the aftermath, but Roland could feel the shift. The valley exhaled, the tension breaking like a held breath. Sylvie's mother landed gracefully beside him, massive wings folding against her body, wet scales glinting in the flashes of lightning. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, the storm itself pausing in awe. Roland met her gaze, steady despite the adrenaline, and for the first time felt a connection that transcended species. The intensity of her scrutiny melted into something softer, warmer, almost reverent. It was a recognition that he had protected her child, that he had faced fear and chaos without faltering, that he was not merely an interloper in their world but a participant in a fragile, sacred bond. Sylvie darted forward, leaping into her mother's chest, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. It was not a roar, not a growl, but a sound that vibrated through Roland's bones, rich with emotion. Relief, love, and grief mingled into one complex note. Roland realized then that dragons, in all their raw, terrifying power, communicated truths that no human words could capture. Sylvie's mother turned her gaze back to him once more, nostrils flaring in subtle curiosity, and with a deliberate gesture, nudged Sylvie toward Roland. It was an unspoken acknowledgement. Their bond was sacred, yes, but his role was accepted, tested, and validated. The storm began to ease, the wind shifting, rain tapering into a soft drizzle. Lightning still flashed across the peaks, illuminating the valley like a cathedral of stone and water, but there was a sense of peace settling over the ravine. Roland, soaked and exhausted, pulled Sylvie close and exhaled, a long, trembling breath. The mother dragon circled once overhead, a silent guardian, before perching nearby, eyes ever watchful. The hierarchy of the valley had been reaffirmed, not through dominance alone, but through courage, empathy, and the delicate intertwining of lives. In the aftermath, Roland explored the valley with Sylvie, now aware of the subtle signs her mother left. The crushed brush indicating her patrols, faint impressions of claws in the soil, the occasional shimmer of scales glimpsed among the cliffs. The mother dragon was near, always, and her presence was both a reassurance and a challenge. Roland understood now that his role went beyond mere protection. He was part of a nascent family, one forged in adversity, trust, and mutual respect. That night, the storm fully subsided, leaving the valley glistening under a blanket of stars reflected in the twin moons. Sylvie nestled against Roland, and he felt the steady pulse of life and warmth beneath her small frame. Her mother observed from a distance, a figure both majestic and intimate, reminding him that the world was vast, unpredictable, and alive in ways that demanded reverence. For the first time in decades, Roland allowed himself to hope, not just for survival but for something rarer: connection, family, and the possibility of belonging. The climax had passed, yet the story's weight remained. The predator had been defeated, the bond between human and dragons solidified, and the valley now hummed with a delicate equilibrium. Roland's reflection was simple yet profound. Life, in all its chaotic beauty, required bravery not only in action but in heart. And he, a veteran of countless wars, had discovered a battle far greater than any he had fought: the fight to protect love, trust, and a fragile, extraordinary family. The valley awoke slowly after the storm, a hush over the land as if the mountains themselves were catching their breath. Sunlight, filtered through lingering clouds, painted the cliffs in warm golds and soft shadows. Birds cautiously returned, trilling above the stream, and small animals emerged from hidden burrows, resuming the quiet rhythm of life. Roland moved among the rocks and trees with Sylvie at his side, her tiny claws tracing the same paths she had explored in the days before the storm. But everything felt different now. The air vibrated with a deeper, almost sacred resonance, as if the valley recognized the trials they had endured. Sylvie's mother had returned to her favorite perch on the eastern cliff, wings folded, eyes scanning the horizon. There was a calm authority in her presence, tempered by the lingering grief of past loss. Roland watched her with a mixture of reverence and gratitude. He knew she had judged him through more than instinct, through the fires of adversity, and had found him worthy. And in that silent acknowledgment, a sense of belonging settled over him. A rare, luminous feeling he had not known since before the campaigns, before the losses, before the solitude became his shield. Days turned into weeks. Roland adapted to a life that was at once familiar and irrevocably changed. He hunted, maintained the cabin, and trained Sylvie, but now their activities carried a rhythm influenced by the ever-present awareness of her mother. The young dragon learned quickly, guided by both human instruction and maternal example. She became a bridge between worlds, the instinct-driven wild and the deliberate, reasoned human perspective. Roland marveled at the subtle intelligence she exhibited, not only in her reactions to the environment but in her growing capacity for understanding his intentions, emotions, and even the nuances of human speech. On quiet evenings, Sylvie would perch on his shoulder as he worked, and Roland would talk to her in long measured tones about everything and nothing. The color of clouds, the peculiar music of rivers, the abstract shapes of mountain shadows at twilight. Her mother often observed, not intrusively, but with a steady, watchful presence that communicated both authority and trust. It was in these moments that Roland realized how much he had learned from them both. About patience, about empathy, about the subtle bonds that could form between beings so different in form yet similar in essence. One day Roland discovered a small nest hidden in a crevice near the cabin, overlooked until now. Inside were fragments of eggshell, still faintly warm, a testament to Sylvie's mother's past loss, a silent chronicle of grief that had driven her protective vigilance. Roland's chest tightened as he absorbed the symbolism. Life, death, and renewal intertwined. He understood that his presence was more than a human convenience. He was now a participant in the living narrative of this dragon family, their stories weaving together in ways both tangible and ineffable. Roland also began to notice subtle changes in the valley itself. Plants once cautious and sparse flourished in places where dragons had roamed. Water shimmered in richer hues, as though reflecting not just the sky but the vitality of life around it. He sometimes caught glimpses of his own reflection in the stream, side by side with Sylvie, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not a battle-worn veteran but a guardian, a teacher, a companion. The emotional scars that had once dictated his solitude began to soften, replaced by a new awareness. Life, even after violence and loss, could offer moments of beauty, connection, and hope. There were, of course, challenges. The predator had not been vanquished entirely. Roland remained vigilant, aware that danger could return at any moment. And Sylvie's mother, despite her trust, demanded respect and patience, reminding him that he was a guest in her world, even as she allowed him a place within it. Yet the tension no longer felt oppressive. It was a shared understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of limits and capabilities. Trust had been forged in the crucible of storm and fire, tempered by respect and endurance. Evenings became a ritual of reflection. Roland would sit on the highest accessible ledge, Sylvie curled in his lap, her mother nearby, observing with soft, luminous eyes. They watched the twin moons rise, their pale light casting intricate patterns across the valley. Roland spoke softly, recounting tales from the distant worlds he had once known, yet now they felt more immediate, more intimate, stories shared not to impress or instruct, but to connect, to weave invisible threads between human and dragon hearts. And in those moments, he realized that he had found not only a family but a new purpose: to nurture, to protect, to belong. The resolution was quiet, almost understated. There was no grand declaration, no ceremony. It was found in the rhythms of daily life, in the small gestures of trust and understanding, in the mutual recognition of courage and vulnerability. Sylvie's mother occasionally nudged Roland's shoulder with her massive snout, a reminder that his place in their family was accepted, but never taken for granted. Sylvie, ever playful, would chase dragonflies along the stream, her laughter like chirps echoing off the cliffs. And Roland, for the first time in decades, felt fully alive in a way that no battlefield or campaign could ever provide. The valley, once a symbol of isolation, had become a sanctuary. Roland understood now that survival was not the ultimate goal, connection, empathy, and the courage to embrace the unpredictable currents of life were far more profound. The narrative of a human veteran and a lost little dragon had evolved into something larger. A story of reconciliation, of trust forged across species and circumstance, and of the extraordinary bonds that could arise from acts of care, courage, and devotion. And so, as the sun dipped below the peaks and the stars shimmered in twin constellations above, Roland, Kale, Sylvie, and her mother existed in fragile, beautiful harmony. The valley breathed around them, alive with the pulse of a world that had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately allowed them to find their place together. A human and dragons bound not just by chance, but by the enduring strength of compassion, courage, and love. Weeks had passed since the storm and the battle in the valley. Roland had settled into a rhythm that balanced survival, teaching, and observation. The mountains, once a place of stark isolation, now felt like a living home, responsive to the heartbeat of the family he had become part of. Sylvie had grown noticeably, her wings longer, scales more iridescent in sunlight, her movements more assured. Each day she practiced flying with her mother or alongside Roland, gliding through the crisp mountain air with a mixture of precision and exuberance that never failed to bring a rare smile to his weathered face. Sylvie's mother, the widow whose loss had once defined her, began to reveal more of herself, not just the sorrow and vigilance, but wisdom, patience, and subtle playfulness. She allowed Roland to join in hunting excursions, not as an intruder, but as an active participant in the natural rhythms of her world. He learned the nuances of dragon communication, the language of gestures and subtle vibrations, the way emotions could ripple through scales and wings as clearly as spoken words. Roland marveled at the depth of their intelligence and the layers of empathy embedded in every action, realizing that these creatures had taught him far more than any human mentor ever had. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the valley, casting long silver reflections across the stream, Roland sat at the edge of the cliff with Sylvie perched on his shoulder. Below, the mother dragon's wings stretched wide as she patrolled the perimeter, vigilant yet relaxed, a silent guardian of both the valley and their fragile family bond. Roland reflected on how much had changed since that first day when he had rescued Sylvie from the jagged rocks. He had once believed his purpose was survival, that life's worth was measured in victories on distant battlefields. Now he understood that his true purpose was subtler, quieter, yet infinitely more profound: to nurture, to protect, to foster trust across worlds. The predator that had once threatened the valley never returned, perhaps deterred by the formidable presence of Sylvie's mother and the bond she had forged with Roland. The mountains themselves seemed to acknowledge the shift, their forests denser, the streams more vibrant, and even the wind carrying a gentler, more harmonious song. Life, Roland realized, was not merely about avoiding danger. It was about engaging with it, transforming it, and finding harmony amidst chaos. A subtle change had occurred in Roland himself. The war-hardened veteran, once distant and unapproachable, had discovered the capacity for patience, empathy, and joy that he had thought lost. His scars, both physical and emotional, remained, yet they no longer defined him entirely. They were tempered by the trust of two dragons, by the responsibility of caring for a life younger and more fragile than his own, and by the quiet, enduring satisfaction of knowing that he had contributed meaningfully to something beyond himself. On a crisp morning, while scouting the cliffs with Sylvie, Roland noticed something remarkable: the mother dragon circling higher than usual, then pausing to glance down at him. There was a subtle nod in her posture, an acknowledgement that he had proven himself not only as protector but as partner in understanding, a human who had earned the right to stand beside them. Sylvie chirped in delight, and her mother dipped her wings gracefully before soaring back toward the distant peaks, leaving Roland with the weight and warmth of belonging pressing gently against his chest. As the days passed, Roland began to contemplate what lay beyond the mountains. He knew that danger could return, that other predators might challenge the fragile peace of the valley. And yet he no longer feared the unknown. He understood now that he and Sylvie, alongside her mother, were part of a living ecosystem that balanced strength, intelligence, and empathy. He could not control every variable, but he could honor the trust placed in him, nurturing the bond that had transformed both his life and the life of the small dragon he had adopted. Symbolically, the valley had become a reflection of his journey, a place once harsh and unforgiving, now vibrant and alive, echoing the growth, resilience, and interconnectedness of all living things. He often imagined future adventures, not just with Sylvie, but potentially with other dragons, humans, and creatures of the wild. The possibilities were vast, mysterious, and thrilling, a reminder that life was never static, that every ending was also a beginning. Roland took a deep breath, the cool mountain air filling his lungs with clarity and purpose. Sylvie nuzzled him in return, small wings fluttering, and he whispered, "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The mother dragon, watching from a nearby cliff, tilted her head, a gesture of silent approval and acknowledgement. For the first time in decades, Roland felt fully integrated into a family that spanned species, a story that had begun with loss and fear but now unfolded with trust, love, and hope. The stars glittered above, twin moons casting their pale light across the mountains, the stream, and the trio below. The valley, alive with subtle energy, seemed to hum a lullaby of continuity and promise. Roland understood that this was only the beginning, not merely of adventures with Sylvie and her mother, but of a life fully lived, shaped by courage, empathy, and the bonds that defied time, species, and circumstance. And as the night deepened, Roland closed his eyes, letting the gentle rhythm of the valley, the warmth of Sylvie curled against him, and the watchful presence of her mother envelop him. The story of a human veteran, a lost little dragon, and a grieving yet powerful dragon widow had reached a beautiful equilibrium. Yet, somewhere in the mountains, the wind whispered of future challenges, new wonders, and the enduring, unbreakable connection between them. The valley slept, but their journey, the human and the dragons, was far from over.